Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gaming Tutorial video, we're going to be discussing Ryse, son of Rhyme, primarily a reduction in polygon count, which would be 150,000 reduced to 85,000. We're going to be discussing the shading, resolution, and more. I would recommend you don't just listen to the audio, I would also recommend you watch the video, because at certain points there's going to be some key visual elements which are going to really help you to demonstrate exactly what's going on with the title. So anyway, it's worth noting that it's not just resolution which makes a game look better. There are a number of other factors, of course, which go into it, and these include, but definitely are not limited to, lighting and textures. But before we start to speak about that, let's discuss the tweets that started this all off. And these actually came about from Savat Yeli, who is the Crytek's boss, and he said on Twitter, so some of this is going to be broken English, but I'm going to read it pretty much verbatim. Hero Marius, 85,000 polygons, it was a choice. 150k polys with LODs versus 85,000 with better shading plus no LODs, stable. The later WO at better quality. Then he added further, looks better than E3, shaded deeper, more real. Marius features additionally also real-time physically dangling pieces plus much more. He added again, there is not one single downgrade compared to E3, promised only upgrades in the final push towards the finaling phase. It's full HD XP. Tons of diff, zero downscale, vast improves and optimizations, poly optimizations are all in invisible parts, all good. Then finally, Ryse runs at 1600 by 900, also known as 900p of course, for best performance and res. We apply an upscale for AA, frame buffer native 1080p, same as E3, Xbox One, no change, no compromise. By the way, from what we understand, there was originally rumours that Ryse was running at 1080p. Apparently this isn't the case. Comments now are going about that it is always running at 900p, so we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Nevertheless, one of his followers, I'm going to leave the name out for the purposes of privacy, but they then added native res, then all. Hypothetically, if the title was developed on the PS4, would hit same hurdle. Then Yearly answered, yes, as a choice wasn't on a hurdle, it was for efficiency, as no perceived visual difference as final output is 1080p. Okay, so to clarify all of this and to make it somewhat less garbled English for you guys, he's basically saying that it wasn't Xbox One hardware that was causing the thing. He said it would have happened whether it was on the PlayStation 4. Now, of course, a lot of people are skeptical about this, but we're going to leave that for just one side. And first of all, let's clear up what level of detail is. So the first thing we're going to do is to take a look exactly what level of detail is. Now, I did say, of course, you should be definitely paying attention on screen, and we're going to be using UDK or Unreal Development Kit to give us a little bit of an example. Right now we're in what is known as the content browser on UDK, and using content browser you can actually take a look at a variety of different materials, and using those materials you can kind of get an idea of what the various details are available to you. Now, level of details are very important because, as I've mentioned previously, the further you are from an object, the less detail that you need to actually look at. So let's have a look at, for example, particle systems, and let's search, actually let's just click on all assets, particle systems, and we'll type in shock, all will become clear in a moment. So right here, we have a fairly nice particle system. It's actually from the shock weapon, the shock rifle, in Unreal Development, and you'll be fairly familiar with it if you've played Unreal before. So let's just double click on this. So right now we're fairly far away from this object, so I'm just going to zoom us in a hair. And you can see that it's got a fair amount of detail. You can see that the animation around the kind of center as it pulses. But what you can do is you can actually drop it to a lower level of detail by simply pressing this. And you can see that the amount of detail in that particle drops fairly significantly, actually. Let me just show you that again. Okay, so we've got an idea. Now let's have a look at something a little bit different. Let's have a look at something that has more... let's go with something like a skeletal mesh. So let's just click on that and have a look at some cool little objects. Obviously all credit goes to Epic for this stuff. I haven't, done a darn thing on this. Okay, let's use this, which is of course a vehicle in Unreal. So you can see it looks fairly cool, but you can actually reduce the quality by simply doing that. You can see that, for example, the polygon count on the wheels is noticeable. Notice the wheels right now, and then as I put it back to say B. So right there you can see a rather significant difference. So if we were to, for example, zoom out far enough, and then we were to use variety of different level of detail levels, you can see that indeed you can see it kind of popping in, and that is all to do with, of course, the level of detail. So obviously variety of different objects is all going to be different. I'll try to show you guys one more just for the sake of it. Let's go with, let's see, that looks pretty cool. This definitely has quite a lot of detail in it. You can see it's some kind of robotic dude, and he has, I have absolutely no idea what this is, but you can see how many polys and so on this thing actually has. It's got about 15,000 polygons this sucker's made out of. So if we were to that's the base. Now the base is pretty obvious, it's the normal amount of polygons, but obviously we can kind of reduce this, so you see it kind of becomes more and more simplified. This looks like something you'd expect in something like, say, System Shock 1. What's really interesting as well is if you take a look at the bones and polys, notice how there's a significant reduction. I'm just going to show you guys jumping between a couple, and then that one. So I mean, that looks alright, it doesn't look terrible, but it's roughly half. So you can see each time they're roughly reducing the polygon count by 50%. And that's fairly significant when you think about it. But this is all done for the purposes, of course, of optimization. And we could, for example, click on this guy as well. I'll just show you guys him as well, just because he looks fairly mean-looking. He's a mean-looking mother. Let's go with that, because he's got fairly good amounts of detail, I think, at the back. And, of course, base, nothing. No difference between base and auto. And, apparently he's only got one level of detail. Okay, fair enough. He doesn't actually have that much anyway. But you guys get the idea. I could go through the rest of them, but it's going to take a long ass time. And I think you get a fairly reasonable-ish idea of how, how it works. Obviously, this is the same for different aspects as well. Now, I'm going to show you guys one last thing regarding this. I'm going to enable what is known as view culling and occlusion. I've mentioned this in another video, and you can check that out actually by typing culling on the channel, and it'll come up with a lot more on this. And basically, if you take a look at this, you can see that everything renders quite nicely. Don't worry about the fact the tree's purple, it's just because I have a nice selection there, don't you know? So you can see everything looks rosy and fine. So, great. But what happens if I turn my camera? Well, what's going on here? Why does it look crap? Well, let me turn my camera. And then let's do the same that way. Okay, so anyone got an idea of what's going on? That's right, of course, it's simply not drawing the details because it's trying to save GPU performance. So that's just one other small example there. So hopefully it gives you a rough indication of what level of detail is. By no means is this a de facto thing, but hopefully with the rest of the video as well, you'll kind of get an understanding. Now, what we don't have is we do not have a gauge, or in other words, we don't have the debugging tools to see if the GPU utilization for the Xbox One is higher now than what it used to be. It's very difficult, however, to argue that the old build with 150,000 polygons actually looks better, at least in my personal opinion, obviously, than the new build with 85,000. You'll notice that particularly textures, for example, on the face and on the armor, as well as the background, as well as the shading, definitely do look a little bit nicer. Now, the general purpose of level of detail is to reduce the rendering load on the GPU, and it does it quite substantially, might I add. But with the removal of LODs, in theory, it will mean that we're going to be getting better looking characters. Also, in theory, this does mean that we're going to actually be getting equal, maybe even slightly higher polygon counts than previously, particularly in crowded scenes. Now, 150,000 polys definitely sounds a lot more impressive than 85,000. I mean, it's roughly twice the amount. But it's, in my personal opinion, definitely noticeable in terms of anti-aliasing, in terms of improved textures, and in terms of improved overall weather effects, for example, that there has definitely been a purpose behind this. They haven't just cut it for the sake of cutting it. Now, some people are going to immediately point out, well, what about the PlayStation 4? You know, could it run it? Now, you and I both know that Crytek can't exactly be 100% honest here, because obviously they're making an Xbox One exclusive. I personally, I mean, let's make a couple of assumptions here. Let's assume that the developers who have been saying the PlayStation 4 is roughly 40 to 50% more powerful in terms of raw GPU/memory performance are correct, right? So if you enter assumption 1, then logically, if you're walking down that path, the second assumption is that if it was on the PlayStation 2, there would be better something. I'm not necessarily saying that they would have kept the resolution at 1080p, or they would have put the resolution to 1080p rather than 900p. It could have been that they left the model quality higher, for example, the texture quality. They could have put higher polygon count. They could have had a higher frame rate, for example. They could have been shooting for, say, 60. They could have gone with even more anti-aliasing. Whatever, really. You know, I'm not developing the game. And this is the problem. A lot of people are making these assumptions. The bottom line is, however, we do not have the debugger tools. We do not have the... Even if you are a games developer, without actually having access to their own readouts, in other words, what the CPU, what the GPU utilization, how much memory bandwidth you're using, you know, what's the size of the textures, what's the size of the polygons in memory, what's doing what, basically. It's very hard to know, is one a downgrade, is one an upgrade? It could be that in rough processing terms, they're roughly pretty much even. Crytek do have a history of wanting everything they can possibly get. I've heard some comments on message boards that have said, well, I'd rather have 1080p, and I'd rather have, for example, more level of detail. So in other words, or, more LOD levels. So in other words, as objects start getting further away and so on. Problem with that, of course, is then other people would argue, well, surely that means that, you're going to get some object pop-in, and some engines do it better than others. Some games it's extremely noticeable. As we saw earlier in the Unreal example, it really depends on how many levels of detail you actually put in to begin with. Personally, I think it's a case of I don't necessarily know or agree the graphics were downgraded. I think the model quality was downgraded. but to make way for other things. I don't, however, think that, you know, everything is exactly how he's stating. I mean, let me go back to the quote. I've got so many bloody items open. They said full HD XP. He claims, obviously, full HD is technically 1080, so that's not exactly true. My personal opinion. He also said no compromise. Well, I'd argue that if you're going to 900p, that's kind of a compromise, because if there's no compromise, you know, I suppose it really depends on your perspective. However, my personal opinion on this, I actually like the look of Ryse, Son of Rome. As some of you may be aware, I actually think it's one of the cooler looking launch titles for the Xbox One. Would it have looked better on the PlayStation 4? Probably. Although, once again, it's very important for all of us to remember that this is really early stuff on both systems. And the reason I'm trying to point that out emphatically is because we are not seeing how consoles are going to eventually look, right? We're looking at titles that are, because it's first generation stuff, this is not going to be, this is it. This is going to be, you know, what all the new games are going to look like, period. As I've said before, if you look at the progression between, say, the PlayStation 3 to, you know, late PlayStation 3, well, should I say early PlayStation 3 to late PlayStation 3, it's massive. When I first looked at some of the PS3 games, I was like, it's okay. I had exactly the same feeling with Xbox 360 titles as well, but now they look pretty damn impressive. I mean, one of the big jumps for me, obviously, was like, look at Perfect Dark Zero, and then take a look at, like, Gears of War, which, you know, isn't really that much later if you think about it. Even Cameo, take a look at Cameo, which looked good for the launch titles, and then look at the latest titles now. It's massive. I mean, even GTA 4 to 5 is incredible. I'd also like to point out that some of the titles on launch on Xbox 360, despite their mandate for like 720p, some of the titles, for example, Forza, I think Perfect Dark as well, wasn't actually 720p. They actually got it, I think it's 600. But obviously, as they got more and more used to the hardware, the graphic fidelity improved. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. I personally believe Ryse, Son of Rome looks really good. I don't know if it's an upgrade or downgrade in terms of the amount of work the console is doing. That's one way to categorize an upgrade or downgrade. Is the console physically processing more work? Does it look better? I personally think, looking at the screenshots that have been posted on Twitter, doing a little bit of soul searching, I think that the textures definitely look better. But that's my personal opinion. I'm not saying it does, I'm just saying personally I think it does. Would it look better on the PlayStation 4? I don't know. Crytek are saying it's not a compromise, although you could argue that they are, of course, playing favoritisms. I wouldn't be surprised if it would look better on the PlayStation 4 if the other developers that have spoken about both systems are telling the truth or have been accurate. Not that I'm not going to accuse them of lying. I'm instead going to say that they've been accurate and they currently believe that 40% difference in power, if that is true, then obviously Ryse would look better on the PS4. But once again, all of that is making assumptions. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Hopefully it's cleared some stuff up. I'm sure we're not even slightly done on this topic. But for now, take care of yourselves, and bye for now.